Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today's talk is going to be about the rise, the fall, and the legacy of iOS jailbreaking. So let's get started. My name is Nicolas Haunold. I'm 23 years old. I was born in Vienna and raised here, actually, in the 21st district. I'm a college dropout. After a few years at the University of Vienna, I decided that I'm not an academic. I don't think I'll ever be. So I decided to pursue my passion as a software engineer at Airbnb in San Francisco. But let's get to the meat of the talk. Today's talk is going to be about this device. And I'm sure some of you have some version of it in your pockets. In particular, I'm going to be talking about what you can and what you can't do, and more so what Apple didn't want to let you do, and how you could eventually do it. So before we dive too deep, let's take a step back. Let's take roughly 11 years back, when this device was introduced. The very first iPhone. It could do so much, but looking back, it could do so little. So let's start with a few key differences that back then, that now we take for granted, but maybe back then we didn't. First off, wallpapers. Henry Ford once said, any customer can have a car painted in any color as long as it's black. Steve Jobs just kind of took that saying very literally. For the first 4 years of the iPhone, you couldn't really change the wallpaper. The wallpaper, it was black. You guessed it. So this next thing, notification center. Everything we take for granted, we get spammed with notifications these days. Back then, we didn't have notifications, and until a few years after, we didn't even have a backlog to see them all. Next up, personal hotspot. We didn't have that until a few years after the iPhone got introduced. It must have been 2011 or something. But we now really use it, right? It's a day-to-day thing for most of us. So it comes down to extending technology beyond its capabilities. Some people had this functionality. You could read newspaper articles about it, some people hacked their iPhones, they turned to the dark side. How come these people had that functionality before Apple ever implemented it? Well, there was a tightly knit community, and that's what this talk is about. And they cared about one thing, and they cared about one thing deeply, and that's extending technology beyond its capabilities. Because we all kind of knew this thing in our pockets could do so much more. So how do we do it? We do it through this thing called jailbreaking. And that's kind of a fancy term for hacking the iPhone, but it kind of also went off the spotlight in the past few years as Apple got too caught up and implemented a lot of things that previously we used jailbreaks for. So I had a chance to contribute to the scene back when I started, in middle school. I just kind of accidentally came into it and continued to stay there because there were a lot of interesting projects that went on, and to be honest, I learned a lot of programming through that scene. Jailbreaking basically refers to accessing the file system of the iPhone's operating system. If you don't know, iOS is powered by the same operating system that powers the Mac, Mac OS, which means that you have a Unix-powered operating system in your pockets with you at all times. So how does a typical jailbreak work? But before then, we have to realize that the first iPhone and the first iOS were a security nightmare. What is now considered the world's most secure operating system started as something that barely had any protections at all. All applications were running as root. There was no code signing. There was no memory protection, which meant, if you are familiar with Stack Overflows and a few security techniques, as soon as there's something happening, you're kind of screwed. You got the entire device. And that happened due to the insane amount of pressure that resided within Apple to get this thing out of the door. A lot of things were neglected, and that's okay, I guess. But it allowed us to basically break the mobile jail, which was what a jailbreak was initially at first. Because the iOS has two partitions. It has a system partition and it has a mobile partition. And by default, you were jailed as a BSD term to the mobile partition. And you're kind of trying to get out of it, right? All the meaty stuff, all the goodness, where you could, start to execute executables, start a root shell, maybe launch even other applications. That was limited to the systems partition. So the first jailbreak, as soon as you got some device access, which I think just happened by remounting the Apple's internal file service, was basically just you take the root partition, and instead of having it read-only, you'd go read-write. But quickly, Apple realized that, and things got a lot harder. So then you started to play around with Sandbox and privilege escalation. So suddenly you were like jailed to, or like you were just limited to the mobile user, right? So you needed to get out of the mobile user. So there were exploits towards that, right? And then like you had to deal with a sandbox. For example, if you started to get into the system through Safari, the browser, Safari could only access certain paths in the file system, and everything else was kind of blocked by the kernel. So later on, what do you do when you're blocked by the kernel? You own the kernel, which meant that you needed a kernel exploit to kind of in-memory patch all the sandbox protections and everything that was around it. Then, of course, came code signing. So what you do when you have kernel access, you kind of patch the code signing out. One of the probably most famous and probably most user-friendliest remote code exploits ever existing was this thing called JailbreakMe. And JailbreakMe happened in 3 iterations. It first off came out in 2008 or 2007 as just this thing where you go on a website, you press JailbreakMe, and next thing you know, you have a third-party app store on your device. And that, we thought, that was it. Like it would never, something like this would never exist again. And then the community came along and started, rethinking this idea. We had a few other exploits. They started coming from the bootloader up and kind of going up the chain of trust. But we decided, let's take a step back. Let's see what else we can do from the user land. Because the idea of JailbreakMe, where you didn't even have to plug in something, you just visited a website, you tapped a button, and suddenly you had full access to the device. You were completely the security was hosed. So here's screenshots of JailbreakMe and kind of the 2 prominent versions of it, where we really tried to make it as accessible as possible. The first JailbreakMe was basically there was no UI. You just visited some URL, suddenly the next thing you know, it seemed really sketchy. So a big part of our community was to make jailbreaking accessible, because it was a legal thing, right? A lot of people associate hacking with something that is illegal, a lot of piracy, but we wanted to showcase the community and everything that we kind of did. We wrote applications, we wrote legitimate applications, because we knew this device could do so much more than Apple let us do. So that's why we approached it the level from the first entry point. If the jailbreak is sketchy, how can we ever convince users to install our applications that we build genuinely? So we tried to kind of replicate that experience, right? So we built the lock screen. I remember trying to get the gradients right for ages. And that's kind of replicated the experience when you initially unlocked the iPhones. They recently changed this a few years ago, but that's how it was the first 5 years. And then in its 3rd iteration, it was kind of modeled after the App Store page. So as soon as you would tap the free icon, there would be another confirmation, and then it would have the animation. It would pop up the Cydia icon on your screen. It would literally be as native as possible. But as soon as you press that button, we already had code access to your device, and everything was kind of done. So that led us to the next thing that I was involved in, at least, which approached the entire hacking thing from a different perspective. Greenpoison was one of the things that I personally devoted a lot of time towards. And first off, forgive us for that spelling. We're all older now. Greenpoison, it was a tethered jailbreak, which meant that every time you would have to, every time you would shut down the iPhone, you'd have to re-hack it. And that meant you'd have to connect it, you'd have to run it. And I remember a lot of personal times when I did that, and suddenly my phone went out of battery, and I couldn't use it until someone had a laptop and I could re-hack it again. That was really annoying. But instead of going through a web browser, you would start from the bottom up. So I still remember when we found that exploit for greenpoison. It was in the bootloader of the iPhone. I was writing this program called iRecovery that would allow you to connect with your iPhone and execute commands on the bootloader. Very legitimate, nothing basically rebuilding an internal tool that Apple had just to support, to kind of use iPhones in support requests and kind of fix them. So once I wrote this tool, I was okay, I think I did this by accident. I had a for loop that would, send this USB message, but it always incremented the control number. So eventually, when you hit this control number, like CRX212, the iPhone crashed, and I was like, okay, so like it's rebooting, something's happening there. So we started investigating, and it turned out that all the data that you kind of wrote or sent to the control message would end up in memory and like overriding a certain part of memory. I think the first 2,000 bytes or something. That was enough to kickstart an exploit and to just kind of like take over the entire device. And from there on, you could patch the kernel in memory, you could start the operating system, and at that point, you had the entire operating system. So what's next? You have entire control of the device, but that doesn't make an ecosystem, right? So people knew that, and people wanted to change it from what kind of existed before. So we needed to port a lot of applications. We needed to port a lot of user space applications. One of them was Debian's package manager, APT. The majority of the users, though, they wanted something user accessible, because the iPhone, the iPhone always excelled in user experiences and in user interfaces. So we didn't want to just leave this as like a very nerdy thing. We wanted to make it very accessible. So one of the guys, Jay Freeman, also known as Sarek, stepped up and started working on a software that was called Cydia. And it is, and also was, one of the pillars of the jailbreak community. What is Cydia? Cydia is the third-party app store. And it basically provided apps that Apple didn't want to have on their app store, for a variety of reasons. Maybe there were a lot of things that competed with Apple back in the days. They didn't want to have it. But some of the applications were also just frowned upon. I think before there was an H rating on the App Store. Even if there was a slightest swear word, Apple would deny it. So on Cydia, there was kind of your chance to do it, but Cydia was never really known for actual applications. Cydia was known for this thing called tweaks. And if you were to take an App Store app, and you would kind of symbolize it, it would be limited to this app icon on your home screen, right? The app would live in that app icon, but outside of it, there would be nothing resemblant to that app, right? The app couldn't do anything outside of it. Tweaks were kind of the opposite of that. Tweaks could do anything they wanted. I think a good analogy to tweaks is a remix, if we take it from the music world, right? We could take the entire operating system and we'd see that, they didn't let us change the wallpaper, it would always be black. Well, our remix was kind of that you could put there any image that you wanted, right? And people did this for a variety of things. People did different icon layouts, they had the notification center, they even put those widgets that from Android that are mid-screen. We had all of those things because people were kind of interested to see does that work? And they provided mock-ups, I think, for Apple to just kind of slowly replicate those experiences. A lot of those tweaks over the years were copied by Apple, and then in the next iOS release, you would start to see, oh, Apple started copying this tweak, so we don't need that anymore. And that happened over and over and over again. So one of the things that I did was this thing called YourTube, and it basically made YouTube yours. I was on a limited data plan back in the days, and I couldn't just watch videos all the time on YouTube. They would be streaming, and I'd always hit the quota, everything would get slow. That was really annoying. So my favorite videos and my favorite songs and everything else, I'd have to download them. So I started looking into this with friends, and we were like, hey, can we use Cydia Substrate, which was that technology that allowed you to just go anywhere, to use it to add a download manager. And so we did that. And we wanted to make it native. There were third-party applications that would let you download YouTube videos, but we were like, we can do so much better than that. We don't just have a separate application. How about we make it as if Apple added the functionality, with all the native animations, with all the beautiful UI. So we started doing that, and we started putting it out there, and there was a great, it just kind of started taking off. So we started adding features, and it became a bit of a cat and mouse game between Google, YouTube, Google, Apple, and us, because as soon as we'd push a feature, they'd kind of shut it down. And the same thing what Apple would do with all the jailbreaks, so it happened on multiple layers. It got frustrating after a while. But eventually, we started adding more features, right? They would start introducing advertisements. Well, we would have functionality that would block those advertisements. They would start limiting your quality to low quality, 320p or something. Well, we'd introduce functionality that lets you pick any quality, because we knew the iPhone could display HD quality videos. Our big coup at the end was that we just decided to allow you to extract the audio track and import it as a song into your iTunes library, which then became a bit controversial, but we only did it for the valid reasons, of course. There was also this thing that we worked on called Celeste. A lot of the times, like Bluetooth was very limited on the iPhone. Bluetooth was used for like Apple's internal communication, so Celeste was another one of those really big tweaks because a lot of people wanted to share music, photos, videos with feature phones, right, with other smartphones. And they also supported this like generic Bluetooth file sharing standard that you'd use like back in the days with your Sony Ericsson. Called OBAX, but like Apple was no. We don't even like have the notion of like a file system. Why would we ever like allow you to share it? Like they slowly introduced AirDrop, but you could only use that with iPhones. And eventually we got tired of that. We wanted to share our photos with our friends, and the only way to do that was through Bluetooth. So we kind of implemented an OBAX Bluetooth stack. And it kind of went from there. And that was also like one of the reasons why people started adopting those jailbreaks more and more often. But let's ask ourselves the question, where are we now? Because over the recent years, this has kind of taken off. Like, let's go back to the year like 2013. You started hearing less and less about it, right? Like, I think there must have been like the introduction of iOS 7 when the entire jailbreaking thing started to like slow down a little bit. Well, there was this meme, I think, on the jailbreaking Reddit, which was always like, where's the next jailbreak? When next jailbreak? Kind of like those things that you know from the blockchain community these days. Like, people started making up memes, and eventually it just became a bit tiring, because the cat and mouse game between Apple and the jailbreakers became a bit of a drag. Everyone started, like, first off, after jailbreak, people were really like unthankful. Or at least, if they were outspoken, they were. I know really a lot of people were thankful, right? But like, customers and users would always lose their jailbreaks, right? And like, people couldn't upgrade them because the jailbreak would like take time. But it's also that, for certain versions of the iOS, you were thinking that, it requires not just one vulnerability now. It doesn't require 2 vulnerabilities, but it requires like 4 to 6 like industry, like very severe exploits, right? Like, those things where certain authoritarian governments would probably get very, very jealous about them and actually want to have those exploits. So, like, in a lot of ways, you can say, like, with great power comes great responsibility, and, maybe we've just lost that point, or we're just like, like, we didn't just want to handle that territory anymore. Because, like, if you have 4 or 5 exploits that literally can host an entire operating system that is used by, well, the majority of the world, it's hard to feel good with that, right? So I think the other part is also that I think we just all grew up. Back in the days when this whole thing started, a lot of us were really young. We were in college, we were in high school. Of course, that's just like an average and just like a small like segment of it, but the majority of the people were. So like, we had nothing better to do. We wanted to make sure that we had a good experience. We wanted to implement features that Apple back then didn't have, but we just kind of had this vision that this device just could do so much more. So in a lot of ways, people just, found their jobs, started getting into niches that they really enjoyed. Some of them went into security development. Some of them found a job. From personal experience, I can say getting a monthly paycheck is surely a nice thing. I definitely didn't get that back in the day. So, like, what can we take away from all of this? Well, we helped making the iOS the most secure operating system on the world, I believe, because without the constant back and forth game, I'm sure Apple wouldn't take security as important as they do it now, because we kind of just always kind of like push them to like fix those bugs very quickly, and Apple only in the few recent years starting to really up their game on security. They started to have a dedicated team, and they started to react to vulnerabilities very quickly. But to be honest, what we can take away from this, it's not really anything new. This has been existing for years. You'd take gadgets, and you'd start to maybe put Linux on it. I was back in the day super inspired by all of the Chaos Communication Congress talks about console hackings and the TomTom hackings and the Wi-Fi routers and everything else. I watched those things to death because that's kind of where all the knowledge came from, right? You'd start reverse engineering, you'd start static code analysis. you'd start just like fuzzing around with anything that you can get and to somehow like get into that device. We've seen this also for Apple in the past. Back then, in 2001, we had iPod Linux, the source of many of our original findings, right? We owe a lot of things to those people because at the end of the day, if something happens within an organization, a lot of code is shared, right? A lot of knowledge is shared. A lot of patterns that you see from the iPod, they were still there for the iPhone. We also saw this with the PlayStation, right? Which also included a lengthy legal lawsuit. But we saw it. And I mean, you know, for various purposes, it kind of succeeded, and we still see it nowadays. We also saw it for the Nintendo Wii. And I think this might actually be the closest thing that we've ever seen to something like Cydia again, is like the homebrew channel for the Wii, because like for the PlayStation and a lot of other hacks, a lot of the times those things just really weren't accessible, right? They were there for the hackers, they were there for the geeks that would kind of like knew their way around a command line, but it was never as user-friendly, and that's what made this scene so unique. Another thing was also that I think Cydia was probably the first like bootleg app store that ever allowed you to pay for applications. Like, a lot of people actually earned their living selling tweaks and like unauthorized applications on Cydia, which kind of like gives you an idea of how large that scene was. So what was different compared to all of those things that we just saw? Well, I think a huge part about this is the legality. If we go back and we look at consoles and we look at a lot of other things, it was mostly about like piracy. That was one of the big things, right? You wanted to get those games for free. And while a lot of development teams had troubles with each other inside of the iOS jailbreaking scene, there was also this common consensus. And this common consensus was always on never breaking any laws. We never wanted to be on the bad side with Apple. We wanted to kind of like play along. You know, we kind of like want to tease them with our vulnerabilities and with our features. But we merely wanted to improve what we bought because we knew this thing could do so much more, right? Like if you have all of those devices in your pocket and like over the years, you'd see people and you'd see Apple adding more functionality that would allow developers to develop better apps. A lot of those were pushed from the jailbreaking community because they started at innovation. You know, they were like, we have those notifications now, but we want to have like a backlog of notifications, right? We want to see where all those notifications came from and kind of like manage them, right? We wanted to have different wallpapers. We wanted to have different icon layouts. We wanted to have like text macros. All of those things came from the jailbreaking community. And that leads us kind of to the last thing, which is the community. Because I think a big part about the jailbreaking scene and the ecosystem came out of the community. It was a community of people that supported each other. It allowed us to grow into avenues that we'd never thought we'd grow into. Career-wise, technically-wise, skill-wise. If you were to tell me I would be speaking here back when I was 16 and just messing around with iPhones, I would have thought you were joking. And the community is not just a thing of the past. Like, there's still the Reddit forums. There's still people trying to develop jailbreaks. It's mostly gone from those dedicated hacker groups into individual developers and security researchers trying to make those jailbreaks happen. Especially, I think there's a huge scene in China. But most of the original people just kind of like got really tired of it, or maybe like the motivation was lost, mostly because the jailbreaks weren't as necessary anymore, right? Apple started replicating everything that we kind of wanted, and we kind of have this ideal device in our pockets anymore. Like, there's not so much stuff anymore that we feel like we need to replicate or we need to do ourselves, because now it's in our pockets, right? Now we can focus on our day jobs. Now we can focus on our studies. At least that was the thing for me, is like, you know, at a certain point, you're like, okay, I can develop those jailbreaks, but like, what's the benefit, right? Like, you find 5 to 6 vulnerabilities, but those are really major. Those get harder and harder to find. Like, they start to become like a half of a year project, and then you're like, okay, for which iOS version am I saving those? And then Apple releases a bug fix for maybe like some feature that was messed up in the original version, and suddenly you'd lose your jailbreak, right? You'd either have to live with a broken iOS and the jailbreak, or you'd have to live with just, you know, a working iOS. And a lot of the times, as Apple started patching up those features and started recreating them, the need for a jailbreak became a lot less. But the community is still there, and I think that's what changed this thing so much entirely from the entire, like, for example, console hacking scene. Is like we focused about accessibility. We focused about usability. We focused primarily not about piracy. We focused about genuine applications that people could develop. We built frameworks. We built user interface libraries to make those jobs as easy as possible. And so the community were not just like all those people on the web, but that's also you, all of you out there. So to all of you, I want to say a big thank you. I want to thank you all. I want to thank probably the entire world for making something possible greater than the sum of its parts. And now I encourage you to go out and do the same for every device that ever comes out. Play around, tweak with it, tease the manufacturer, because if there's only one way to learn how to build an open ecosystem, it's probably that. Thank you. I would love to answer any questions off stage.